What is the relationship between Christianity and the abolitionist movement? And is Christianity somehow uniquely responsible, or did it play a major factor in the beginning, the origins, and the prevalence of the abolitionist movement throughout world history, Western history? And did it somehow play a unique role in the end, for example, of the transatlantic slave trade? That is a legitimate historical question, and there's been a lot written on that subject matter about the relationship between Christianity and slavery, both slavery in the ancient world and slavery in the modern world in the form of the transatlantic slave trade. This video is not so much a response to the actual history or actual historians. Rather, this video is a response to the ways in which apologists, these are defenders of the Christian faith, use the history of Christianity and use the history of things like slavery and science, as we'll see in this video, as a way to somehow bolster the claims of Christianity or justify Christianity as somehow being more morally or epistemologically superior to other worldviews. So on my channel, I've reviewed a few videos by Dr. David Wood. He has a channel called the Apologetics Roadshow, which, as you could guess from the name, is a apologetics channel. But on this channel, he deals a lot with the history of science and history in general, especially as it relates and pertains to Christianity. And the video that I'm responding to is Dr. Wood's critique of atheist critique of Christianity, responding to atheist critiques of Christianity. Now, I'm not really making this video to defend atheism against Dr. Wood's claims. The purpose of this video is to critique some of the historical claims that Dr. Wood makes. And I'll probably break this. I will break this into two parts, because the two big points that Dr. Wood covers in this video are the history of slavery and the history of science. And, I'm a sucker for history of science videos, especially if it's a history of science in relation to Christianity video. It's an area that loosely relates to what my academic interest is related to the history of science. And also, I just see a lot of bad arguments related to this, or arguments that need clarification in context, which is why I make a lot of these videos. So I figured I would make a response to that. Again, not as some sort of justification or defense of atheism. Dr. Wood may or may not have some legitimate critique. I don't know if I want to say legitimate. It's mostly him making fun of atheist response. The overall tone of the video is not too seriously, so I'm not sure how seriously we want to take Dr. Wood here. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, whether or not you think he offers any sort of substantive critique of atheism, but again, not necessarily the purpose of this video. But let's kind of set the stage for a little bit. I'll let Dr. Wood explain the context of why he's making this video, and then from there we can go on to talk about slavery and its historical context.
Help you avoid dumb ideas. So, if atheism has no positive content, where are atheists getting their beliefs and values and rules? They're getting their beliefs and values and rules from somewhere else. This means that, according to atheists themselves, atheism is an ideological parasite sucking the beliefs and values and rules out of other worldviews.
So the central thesis of this video, if you want to call it that, is that atheism is a parasite that sucks its values and beliefs from other worldviews. And Dr. Wood's critique of that is that atheists like to critique Christianity. For example, atheists like to blame Christianity for slavery. And Dr. Wood's pushback is that Christianity is the cause for the abolitionist movement, or that atheists like to critique Christianity for being anti-science or for actively working against the development of science, when in fact, Dr. Wood's going to argue that Christianity is somehow uniquely responsible for the rise of science. And again, I'm not so much dealing with that, but I do want to deal with the historical claims that Dr. Wood's going to make first about slavery, and then in the next video I do about the origins and the nature of modern science. So let's talk a little bit about what he has to say about slavery.
For many thousands of years, the entire world thought that slavery was perfectly normal. They couldn't comprehend a world without it. Christians were part of that world. They were born into it. In the first century, almost a third of the Roman population were slaves.
Okay, so let's start off with that first claim that for thousands of years, people thought that slavery was normal, or the entire world thought slavery is normal. This is the problem with historical narratives like that and the sort of historical revisionism that oftentimes you see in apologetics and in online discourse. Is that statement true? Well, in a very broad general sense, we might be able to, if we have a very loose interpretation of history and of the historical data, on a surface level, we might want to say, well, that seems kind of true because slavery as a institution and slavery as a practice has existed across the globe as long as there's been recorded history. We've had records of people owning slaves, so that kind of seems right, but that's also at the same time a mischaracterization of history because that implies that no one prior to the advent of Christianity, that no one had a problem with slavery. And that, of course, is simply not true. There have been objections to slavery, and there have been people in different cultures who have raised moral, political issue, religious objections to slavery and to owning slaves that are not necessarily connected with Christianity. Now, there's not a lot of these because, to Dr. Wood's, I guess, broad point, slavery was just a very common practice in the ancient and in the modern world, of course. We have examples in the Greek world, like philosophically, Aristotle, of course, will provide a defense and a justification of slavery, but you have other Greek philosophers, specifically the Stoic school of philosophy, that will make arguments not necessarily against the practice of slavery, which we'll get to here in a second, but make arguments against the idea that slaves are somehow lesser than other people because of their status as slaves, and the idea that we ought to treat slaves in the same way that we would treat other people is a concept that can be found throughout Stoic writing. We have other examples of this in other parts of the world. I'm thinking, for example, of ancient India and the emperor, their king, emperor king, I'm not sure what, the king Ashoka, who was one of the, I believe, the first Buddhist king of India who united the Indian subcontinent. Ashoka famously outlawed the practice of slavery, I think in the 4th century BCE. Don't quote me on that. I'm probably wrong, but you just look up Emperor Ashoka outlawing slavery. You'll get a nice little Wikipedia article about that. You also have Emperor Hideyoshi in Japan, and I believe the 14th or 15th century, that outlawed slavery. And you can kind of find subtle objections to slavery in other philosophical and religious literature. We just have to be careful, especially in history. We have to be very careful of these large generalizations because it's so easy in history to find counterpoints to that. But let's go back to what the main purpose of what Dr. Wood is saying here with reference to slavery.
They couldn't comprehend a world without it. Christians were part of that world. They were born into it. In the first century, almost a third of the Roman population were slaves. The number of slaves might be lower in other areas, 10 or 20% of the population, or higher, 40 or 50%, or even more. Slavery was part of the fabric of society. But something kept bothering certain Christians about it. So some of them started freeing slaves. And I don't just mean their own slaves. They would buy other people's slaves and free them. Slavery continued for centuries, but Christians eventually ended it in Christian majority countries. And they were so successful in convincing people it was wrong that Western governments insisted that other nations abolish slavery as well.
So we kind of have this general narrative that's put forward by Dr. Wood, this idea that once Christianity becomes let's historically contextualize this a little bit, that once Christianity becomes the predominant religion of the Roman Empire, of course, practiced a form of slavery, that once Christianity becomes the predominant religion, the picture that Dr. Wood is painting is one of continuity, that more people become Christians, more and more Christians start buying and freeing slaves, and that eventually what happens over time is that these nations, by adopting these Christians and ideas and principles, abolish slavery. So here's what's oftentimes confusing for a lot of people about history. What this boils down to, and what I like to convey to people, is that human beings aren't purely rational creatures or actors. And so, oftentimes, when we look at history, we will, within a particular area, within a particular nation, we will get two opposing, conflicting, contradictory ideas that are both true at the same time. And especially when we're looking at the history of Christianity and slavery, what we're going to see, you can find numerous examples, even in the ancient world, of early Christians who opposed slavery. Now, opposed slavery, there's some qualifications there. There's some early Christians who thought that slaves ought to be treated like any other person ought to be treated. You're going to find numerous examples of that, while at the same time, you'll be able to find numerous examples of Christianity being used to justify and to reinforce the institution of slavery. This is what I mean by contradictory ideas. Both of those things were true in several different cultures across thousands of years at the same time. So, is it true that the modern abolitionist movement was deeply influenced by Christian ideas and practices, values, theologians, all that good stuff? Yes. Is it also true that both ancient and modern slavery used Christianity as a justification for the practice of slavery and the enslavement of people? Also, yes, both of those things are true throughout history. What I don't like about Dr. Wood's presentation is that it is a radical oversimplification of the history of slavery. For one, now maybe can't blame him, it's a 20-minute YouTube video, but the purpose of this narrative that he's constructing is undoubtedly apologetic in nature. And as a result, it kind of very quickly moves over a lot of the complexities of both ancient and modern slavery. Complexities that, I will barely touch on, that I have barely touched on in this video. A lot of it is kind of smoothed over, but it's smoothed over with the point of kind of propping Christianity up and giving it some sort of like special moral status, when in fact the situation was much more complicated. Like I said, both of these things can be true at the same time. And I really just want to take the last bit of this video to give you some quotes by some actual historians. I am not a historian of slavery. I am not a historian of the ancient world. I am not even a historian of Christianity. Again, my focus is on the history of science. So I just want to read you a few quotes that will maybe contextualize this a little bit and help you to see why I'm making this claim, that I think that what we have here is a radical oversimplification of history for apologetic purposes. And let's focus on the practice of ancient slavery, specifically slavery within the Roman Empire. So Rome, of course, after the conversion of Emperor Constantine, became overtly Christian. Rome converting to Christianity did not end the practice of Roman slavery. Now, slavery in Europe after Rome did see a little bit of a decline in the terms of numbers of slaves, and there's a lot of historical reasons why that might be the case. If we were to create, for example, a graph of the number of enslaved people in Europe from roughly 2,000 years ago to, let's say, the 16th century, that graph might look something like, it might have a little curve, right? So the Roman Empire slavery was a very common and widespread practice. We get a little bit of a dip during what we could call the medieval period, medieval Europe, and then an increase in the number of slaves once we get into the modern period with the advent of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this too much because there's a lot of historical explanations that are above my pay scale, so to speak, as to why there's a dip in slavery that has to do with the fall of Rome and has to do with economic reasons. After Rome falls, we don't have that sort of institution of the promotion of slavery with the Roman Empire constantly conquering people, bringing new slaves in. The slave markets kind of shift Beginning in the 5th century, you also have the gradual agricultural transition of most of Europe that a lot of historians will point to, the movement to various forms of serfdom throughout Europe. And, as Christianity becomes more and more popular, and as the church becomes more and more popular, a lot of voices within the church also become louder, specifically those people who are raising objections to slavery. Although, to be clear, the church did also own and enslave people throughout European history. But back to my original point, let's look at slavery in ancient Rome through some of these quotes that I've found. So this first quote is by Chris L. DeWitt. This is from his book, Preaching Bondage, John Chrysostom and the Discourse of Slavery in Early Christianity. I found this book on my library website, and it had some good information about the early context of slavery. This is coming from the 3rd or 4th century specifically, I believe. It's looking at John Chrysostom and the sermons, the like popular level sermons that he preached to his congregation, which DeWitt argues contained both free and enslaved people. So it's just some interesting historical context. But this is what DeWitt has to say about slavery in the Roman world and its relationship to Christianity. Slavery did not directly depart from part of the great doctrinal controversies, nor did it visibly play any deciding role in the politics of the day. So in the early church, there were a lot of debates over some very significant theological issues, such as the divinity of Christ, the nature of the Trinity, stuff like that. What DeWitt is saying is that slavery wasn't one of those popular debates, but practically speaking, it was very much so a part of the lives of Christians during this time period. As he says here, yet it was perhaps more relevant to the ordinary person than any other issue. Slavery, the ownership and domination of the human body by another, influenced every aspect of life in the Roman world and was one of the most influential social institutions in defining one's identity. One was either a slave or an ex-slave or free. And this is from the opening chapter of his book, by the way. So he goes on to say, Chrysostom writes from the perspective of the slaveholders. This is the sermons that he's analyzing. Slaves are advised to be submissive, to serve their masters with their whole life, and to fear them. They do not own any property, for they are the property of their owners. Moreover, Chrysostom is of the opinion that masters do more for slaves than vice versa, since masters have to care for their slaves. So the masters are the one with the more responsibility. Being a good master is therefore seen as a virtuous thing that you could do for somebody else. Furthermore, the church not only accepted slavery as a social institution, but it used the slave model of behavior and mode of existence as a metaphor for the practice of Christian religion. Slavery, the imagery of slavery kind of permeates the Bible, and you can kind of take this into the theological realm too. The composition of Christian theology and the formation of Christian subjectivity and the metaphor of slavery also played an important role in Christian leadership formations, right? You're to be a slave of the church, to be an act towards your fellow man. To be Christ-like is to submit yourself to other people for their service, right? The use of assuming the subjectivity of the slave and its theological and ethical formations, we find that Christianity also had a clear vision for real institutional slaves in society. It was not a vision of the abolition of slavery. The important point here is that our conception of abolitionism, of ending slavery as an institution, just simply wasn't an idea that people had in the ancient world. Slavery was seen as an intricate part of the fabric of ancient reality. And Christianity, when it came along, yes, it did have comments about how to treat slaves, to view slaves as your brother or your sister, but there was no attempt to abolish the system itself or to free people who were slaves in the sense of destroying the institution or to go against the governmental practice of enslavement. Along the same lines, we have this quote by Christopher Furman in his book, Policing the Roman Empire. There were no crusaders for universal abolition at this time in the ancient world. While an ancient Christian or Stoic might esteem a slave as a brother, revolutionary efforts to end slavery were never on the table. So again, abolitionism just wasn't really a thing in the ancient world. And I bring up these quotes by these ancient historians to highlight the fact that Wood's simplistic narrative that as Christianity became more and more popular, more and more Christians started buying and freeing slaves is simply not true. Christianity became the predominant religion of Rome in, let's say, the 4th century. I can't remember the exact date that Constantine converts, but abolitionism didn't become a thing until the 1500s. That's not a few hundred years, as David Wood tries to make it out. That's over 1,000 years of predominantly Christian nations practicing and implementing the institution of slavery. Yes, the abolitionist movement did come out of the Christian tradition. Absolutely, 100%. I'm not denying that. But Christianity also reinforced the practice of slavery for over 1,000 years. History, of course, is very complicated, and I'm going to leave that story there. And I'm going to pick up on the comments that he makes about the relationship between the history of science and Christianity in my next video. Let me know what you all think about this, what you think about Dr. Wood's critique of atheism, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.